Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings for our upcoming 2025 fantasy football drafts. And before we get into today's content, a couple reminders. There are timestamps down in the description of the video for those of you who are looking for my thoughts on an individual player. Additionally, while you're down there, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel as we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season in order to help you capture a 2025 fantasy football championship. Now, besides the content that I'll be providing in order to grant you an advantage, for those of you guys who are looking for even further advantages for your upcoming drafts, and of course every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, be sure to travel down to the description and check out Betr. I'll be partnering with them for the entirety of this season, not only of course providing picks every single episode and putting my predictions to the test, but also providing rankings. So for those of you who sign up today using code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10 and also make that first time play of $1 minimum. Again, that is very essential. Once that is all done, you go ahead and get my ranking sent from my email directly to yours. Over the course of the month of August, every single week, updated draft rankings, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings for every single position, including flex. But the rankings won't stop there, as I'll continue to send you rankings every single Sunday morning over the course of this entire season, weeks 1 through 18. So for those of you who are interested, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. And of course, if you play $10 today, you'll go ahead and get up to $30 instantly. So go ahead and take advantage of that via Betr. Of course, link down in the description. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, so let's go ahead and let's talk about the wide receiver position, beginning with our number one, Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. I mean, again, Ja'Marr Chase, a triple crown winner, had the most receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns amongst all wide receivers last season. Joins a very small group of elite wide receivers who have been able to accomplish that, despite the fact that he did not participate in training camp at all. Of course, this time last year, he was seeking out a brand new contract, unfortunately was not awarded it at the time, so he did not practice throughout training camp and ended up having to utilize weeks 1 and 2 of the regular season as his warm-up. But from weeks 3 through 18, he was unstoppable, averaging 21.65 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format throughout that span of time. And you may be wondering, well, Andrew, isn't it because of T. Higgins being injured that elevated, Ja'Marr Chase to being incredible? Even if we remove that 49 fantasy point performance in which he put up against the Baltimore Ravens on Thursday Night Football without T. Higgins there, when we talk about the 12 games in which he played with T. Higgins last year in a half PPR, he still averaged 20.93 fantasy points per game. There is so much potential for upside for someone like Ja'Marr Chase, who continues to elevate his game every single year. This most recent year, putting up career high numbers in terms of slot usage. He was top 12 in terms of slot receptions, receiving yards, and of course targets. He continues to get himself utilization within that conversation. He'll continue to elevate. But not only was he dominant close to the line of scrimmage, 20 plus yards down the field in terms of the deep ball was incredible. Top 12 in terms of receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns within that category. He truly is the best all-around wide receiver in the National Football League right now, and arguably with one of the best quarterbacks in the National Football League, Joe Burrow. So of course, he's going to continue to stay at the top of this conversation and our number one going into 2025. Now, speaking of Ja'Marr Chase and Joe Burrow, let's talk about one of their former teammates from college, Justin Jefferson, wide receiver of the Minnesota Vikings. Now, even though he's not catching passes from Joe Burrow, we have been able to witness over the course of the last 2 seasons that it doesn't matter who is throwing the ball in the direction of Justin Jefferson. He truly just is an elite wide receiver that is going to make it work regardless. Now, whether it's been, Kirk Cousins, Joshua Dobbs, Nick Mullins, and of course this most recent season, Sam Darnold, the truth of the matter is Justin Jefferson is elevating those quarterbacks with his play. Now, again, many of us this time last year had concerns regarding the potential of Sam Darnold being the starting quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings. And once again, for another consecutive year, many of us are concerned about the potential of J.J. McCarthy and whether or not Justin Jefferson is going to stay at this elite level. The fact of the matter is, Kevin O'Connell, the head coach and of course primary play caller of this offense, is a quarterback whisperer, and he's going to put J.J. McCarthy and Justin Jefferson in positions to succeed this upcoming season. Now, besides the impact that Kevin O'Connell has on the quarterback position, he certainly has made an impact positively upon Justin Jefferson. In the last 43 games in which Justin Jefferson has been healthy with Kevin O'Connell as the head coach of this team, Justin Jefferson's averaging 102 receiving yards per game over the course of the last 3 seasons. And he's been able to score 23 touchdowns in the last 43 games he has played as a Minnesota Viking. I mean, again, this most recent season had 103 receptions, 1,500 receiving yards, and 10 receiving touchdowns, and nobody blinked, because that is the baseline expectation of what we're anticipating to see from Justin Jefferson every single year as he is an elite wide receiver. Going into this upcoming season, of course, he is still currently dealing with some hamstring injury. Of course, hopefully that is going to be cleared up by the time we get to week 1. I anticipate that to be the case, as we've seen him jogging around at training camp in the last couple of days. He should be fine, and of course, in this top tier conversation. Now let's move on to another wide receiver who is a former number 1 overall wide receiver. I mean, again, Ja'Marr Chase in 2024, Justin Jefferson in 2022, and of course, CeeDee Lamb was the number 1 overall wide receiver for fantasy in 2023. So why can't he potentially return to this conversation? He certainly can. I mean, over the course of the last 2 seasons within this offense, he's been able to get himself a 29% target percentage. That means that 29% of the routes that he is running, the ball is going in his direction, which he's been able to accomplish regardless of whether or not it is Dak Prescott or Cooper Rush. But Dak Prescott being present certainly makes an impact, especially considering the amount of upside he found in 2023. But this most recent season, from weeks 1 through 8 with Dak Prescott there, 10.3 targets per game and 15.64 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Now, even though these statistics were fantastic, even with Cooper Rush, he was still able to average 10.3 targets per game and 14.38 fantasy points per game while dealing with a shoulder injury. So, of course, CeeDee Lamb is the engine that runs this offense, and going forward, he's going to continue to get himself a high level of opportunity share and utilization, even with the implementation of George Pickens within this offense. I know many of you may be thinking, is that going to negatively impact the overall target share that CeeDee Lamb has? The way I see it, both of them can't be double covered, and there are going to be a lot of opportunities for them to move the chains now as they have more weapons, which will lead to CeeDee Lamb getting more utilization down within the red zone. And on top of it, what we know for a fact is that the Dallas Cowboys over the course of the last 2 seasons have been in the top 4 in terms of wide receiver targets total. So the anticipation is that, of course, both these wide receivers will get their opportunities. CeeDee Lamb will maintain his upside of 10 plus targets. And of course, as we approach this upcoming season with a healthy Dak Prescott, could very easily be in contention to finish as the number 1 wide receiver overall. Now, the next wide receiver I want to mention is Puka Nacua. Even though he hasn't been able to finish a season of his as the number 1 overall at the position, I think of all the other remaining wide receivers going into 2025, he has the best opportunity to do so. When we look back at last season, once he returned from injury, from weeks 8 through 17, was averaging 10.89 targets per game and 17.7 fantasy points per game. Now, those are incredible numbers, but the following statistics is what really has tipped my mind into thinking that there is a lot of potential for Puka Nacua to finish as the number 1 overall, potentially, come 2025. Last season, in the 278 total routes that he ran, he was targeted 106 times. That is a 38.13% target percentage. That's the highest amongst all wide receivers in the last 19 years. Now, besides that incredible number, last season he had a 3.56 yards per route run average. And that's the 3rd highest average in the last 2 decades in comparison to Tyreek Hill from 2023 and Steve Smith Sr. in 2008. Now, yes, you have Davante Adams entering this offense, but I think Davante Adams is only going to help Puka Nacua. What better wide receiver to join this offense than a wide receiver that has been able to finish as the number 1 overall at the position in prior fantasy seasons? Someone that can impart wisdom upon Puka Nacua and really let him elevate his game to the next level. Now, again, Davante Adams, he could play in the slot role, but he's going to be a primary X on the outside, so it's not going to impact the Puka Nacua role that, of course, Sean McVay has highlighted Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp in over the course of the last couple seasons, and have allowed these players to make careers off of this individual role. Again, the Rams over the course of the last 2 seasons, they have been number 1 in terms of total wide receiver targets per season, and the anticipation is that there's a lot of potential for Puka Nacua to get into this conversation and remain as an S-tier wide receiver in my mind. Of course, the only thing that is stopping him is Matthew Stafford. If Matthew Stafford can stay 100% healthy and play every single game, there's a real shot here in 2025. All right, let's move on and let's talk about my 2025 fantasy football draft guide. Again, for those of you guys who want to get your hands on that, talking about all positions, how to draft, all the encompassing overall rankings included, be sure to go ahead and check out Patreon. There's a link down in the description. All my blood, sweat, and tears this offseason were put into this draft guide. So for those of you who want to go ahead, get your hands on this, and of course, be able to ask me unlimited questions. So if that's something you guys are interested in, getting your hands on my 2025 fantasy football draft guide, asking questions, getting my rankings on a weekly basis, updated, ready to go, and of course, getting the private Discord access to join the community. If that's something you're interested in, be sure to check it out today. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, so we saw Amon-Ra St. Brown on that screen. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown to begin the A tier. Yes, there is an argument that can be made in regards to him being an S-tier wide receiver, but I can't see him finishing as the number 1 overall. And that's primarily because, again, there's a lot of weapons within his own respective offense that are going to be vying for a lot of touches. Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta, Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery scoring touchdowns every single week. But I still truly do believe that Amon-Ra St. Brown is someone that, if you have an opportunity of drafting this season, don't hesitate, because he's been able to be a top 3 wide receiver in each of the last 2 seasons in this offense. And again, this offense has made themselves strides every single season to improve. And even though this upcoming season, I do anticipate to see a little bit of regression based on the fact that Ben Johnson, their former offensive coordinator, is now the head coach of the Chicago Bears, I still anticipate to see Amon-Ra St. Brown ball out. Now, this most recent season, he averaged 8.4 targets per game and 15.36 fantasy points per game, a lot of which were, again, touchdowns scored that really did tip the scales, as his overall opportunity share has diminished in comparison to prior seasons. Even though touchdowns really were the conversation with Amon-Ra St. Brown. I mean, there was an incredible streak of games in which he was scoring consecutive weekly touchdowns. But there were also games last season in which they were winning by blowing out the opposing team, and Amon-Ra St. Brown was not involved at all. In weeks 6, 8, and 12 of last season, he scored 11.7, 7.7, and 9.2 fantasy points with 4, 2, and 7 targets. That is not ample opportunity, and that kind of production just wasn't sufficient enough because of the lack of opportunity, because they were up by 30 points at halftime. So as we approach this upcoming season, if there's a potential in which they're not blowing out teams and we can stay far more competitive, there may be even more utilization for someone like Amon-Ra St. Brown, which would allow him to stay in this conversation, if not take steps forward. I mean, if this offense gets to a balanced position to where they're running the ball less because they're in equal game scripts or even negative game scripts, it would certainly positively impact someone like Amon-Ra St. Brown, but time will tell. Again, he scored 9 touchdowns last season inside the 10-yard line. He was number 1 amongst all players in that category. I expect that number to regress, but even though those touchdowns are going to regress, scoring 12 total, he is still the number 1 wide receiver of an incredibly elite offense in the National Football League, so I still anticipate him to be fantastic this upcoming year. Moving on to our number 6, we have Malik Nabers. I went back and forth whether or not I wanted to rank Malik Nabers ahead of Amon-Ra St. Brown. The deciding factor truly was the quarterback play. Even though Malik Nabers has proven that regardless of who plays quarterback for the New York Giants, he is going to be fantasy relevant, and he is getting himself an upgrade at the quarterback position technically this upcoming season, I was still a little bit worried about it. But as we approach 2025, there's a lot of potential for Malik Nabers to very easily outscore someone like Amon-Ra St. Brown. I mean, this most recent year, he averaged 11.33 targets per game and 14.61 half PPR fantasy points per game. He led all wide receivers in the National Football League in terms of targets per game on average. And over a 17-game span, had he not sustained the concussion last season that made him miss a couple weeks, he would have finished as the number 4 overall wide receiver based on fantasy point per game average. But like I mentioned, he is getting himself a huge improvement at the quarterback position. Last season, the Giants quarterbacks had a 59% accuracy rate. That is one of the worst in the National Football League. And now he goes ahead and gets someone like Russell Wilson, who is going to start at the beginning of the year, who had the 3rd best accuracy rate amongst all quarterbacks last season. I mean, Russell Wilson, he was able to help someone like George Pickens last season, even though he was only getting 7.11 targets per game when they were together, get himself 11 plus fantasy points per game. Now, in the case in which, of course, Russell Wilson gets benched and Jameis Winston has to come in, I mean, Jameis Winston elevated someone like Jeudy last season to 10 targets per game and 17.5 fantasy points per game. Even if Jackson Dart comes in, the entire offense is predicated on funneling the ball in the direction of Malik Nabers, and that was proven last season by his total target share. So as we approach this upcoming season, my expectation is that, of course, going into year 2, he's going to improve as a player, and as the weapons around him improve, specifically the quarterback position, it'll make his job that much easier to score fantasy points. Moving on to our number 7, we have Nico Collins, who's going to close out this A tier. I think Nico Collins could very easily finish within the top 3 of the wide receiver position. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, Nico Collins has averaged 0.595 fantasy points per route run in a half PPR scoring format. That's the best amongst all wide receivers in the last 2 seasons, and he's had himself the most yards per route run and the second most touchdowns per route run amongst all receiving options. The expectation going into this upcoming season with a new offensive coordinator in Nick Caley, again, a former Rams tight ends coach and passing game coordinator, if we're going to be in a position in which the Sean McVay coaching tree is going to provide another incredible offensive mind. Again, just looking at the Sean McVay coaching tree as an offense, Zach Taylor, Matt LaFleur, Kevin O'Connell, this most recent season, Liam Cohen. If Nick Caley can come into this conversation and provide Nico Collins with the ample opportunity share he needs, and go ahead and move him around the formation and utilize him in a plethora of ways, he could very easily finish as the number 1 overall wide receiver at the end of the 2025 season. He just needs to stay healthy and get the opportunities going in his direction. Of course, we know that CJ Stroud's going to have some troubles with his offensive line. Hopefully, he'll just continue to go back to his security blanket every single down with Nico Collins. All right, to begin the B tier, we have Brian Thomas Jr. Now, when we look into the past in regards to wide receiver rookie success, I mean, Brian Thomas Jr. had one of the best seasons all time. He had the 4th best rookie wide receiver season in terms of total fantasy points scored, only behind Jamar Chase, Odell Beckham Jr., and Puka Nacua, 2 wide receivers that are on the screen already. He truly did finish strong from weeks 10 through 18 with Mac Jones as his quarterback, 10 targets per game and 16 fantasy points per game, as he was given an ample opportunity share that led to his success. But now that you have Liam Cohen joining the Jacksonville Jaguars, the former offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2024. Again, an offensive mind that helped elevate that offense from averaging 20.5 points per game to 29.5 points per game as an offense. So if we're anticipating a lot of improvements from this offense, and specifically Trevor Lawrence, then I do anticipate for Brian Thomas Jr. to stay in this conversation. When asked about what the potential of Brian Thomas Jr. is this offseason, Liam Cohen said the following: "Our passing game will run through him. We're going to move him around and likely play more in the slot. If he's going to be utilized in that category, I just want to go ahead and point out what wide receivers of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers did last season. Mike Evans, weeks 1 through 18 when healthy, averaged 14.95 fantasy points per game. You know, even McMillan last season from weeks 14 through 18, 17.4 fantasy points per game. And Chris Godwin as the primary slot receiving option. And again, there's a possibility in which Brian Thomas Jr. is utilized within the slot heavily this season. Chris Godwin, weeks 1 through 7 prior to his season-ending injury, was averaging 16.11 fantasy points per game. You got to remember, Liam Cohen was the offensive coordinator of Cooper Kupp and the Rams back in 2022. Cooper Kupp, throughout that season prior to his season-ending injury, averaged 20.31 fantasy points per game. There's an incredibly high ceiling ahead of Brian Thomas Jr. Hopefully, he's able to capture that. Moving on to our number 9, we have Drake London. Look, Drake London, last season with Kirk Cousins was solid. 9 targets per game, 12.5 fantasy points per game, was going to be a top 12 wide receiver regardless. But the late season heroics of Michael Penix Jr. really does give us a lot of excitement for what the potential of Drake London could look like in 2025. From weeks 16 through 18, the final 3 games of the season, Drake London was averaging 13 targets per game and 19.4 fantasy points per game. Only once last season did he eclipse 100 receiving yards with Kirk Cousins under center. He did that twice in 3 games with Michael Penix, and with Michael Penix getting himself a 39% target share. If a lot of the opportunities are going to go in his direction, we have Darnell Mooney already dealing with an injury this offseason, and of course, Kyle Pitts nowhere to be found on a typical basis. I think Drake London can very easily not only be a top 10 wide receiver, but even better. Going into this upcoming season, we do anticipate him to continue to get his consistent usage. Again, this time last year, we talked about him getting the Puka Nacua treatment, and that's exactly what happened. In the slot position amongst all receivers last season was number 4 in targets, number 7 in receptions, number 5 in receiving yards, number 11 in receiving touchdowns. As long as he continues to get that treatment, whether it's the deep ball, whether it's close to the line of scrimmage, he's going to dominate, score touchdowns, and be, of course, the number 1 receiving option of the Atlanta Falcons offense. Moving on to our number 10, we continue with A.J. Brown, who's been a consistently elite wide receiver year over year. From 2022 to 2024, as a member of the Philadelphia Eagles, he's averaged 15.04, 14.83, and 14.9 fantasy points per game when healthy. This most recent year, like I just mentioned, 14.9 fantasy points per game on 7.75 targets per game, which is the lowest target per game average he has seen since joining this offense. Now again, he did have to deal with the hamstring strain early on in the season. So post hamstring strain, he was still solid, but that could certainly have impacted his overall upside for success. But we truly do believe that the impact was Saquon Barkley's incredible success on the ground and the fact that this offense was taking early leads and running the ball in the second half of games. So if we're to anticipate Saquon Barkley to be a lesser option this year within the running category, that should lead to a lot more passing opportunities for Jalen Hurts and this offense, and of course for the number 1 receiving option, A.J. Brown, to continue to succeed. Again, even with less opportunities per game, was just as efficient last season. So if we're going to be in a position in which he's going to see a 25+% target percentage in terms of 1 out of every 4 routes that he is running, he is getting targeted, fantastic. If he's going to get back into the 9+ target category, which isn't too far away, we got to remember back in 2024, in games in which he had 9 or more targets, he scored 19+ fantasy points in every single one of those games. Has himself a lot of potential for upside. Let's hope he's able to capture it. Number 11, we have Ladd McConkey. That's another second-year wide receiver that we are mentioning within the top 12 conversation because they were all able to capture that in their rookie season and should be able to once again develop and take another step forward. Now, in the case of Ladd McConkey, this is not a wide receiver that we anticipated to see in the top 12 conversation, yet he was able to capture that. Weeks 1 through 10, only a humble 6 targets per game that led to 10.19 fantasy points per game. But once we got to week 11, that's where Ladd McConkey took over. from week 11 to the NFL playoffs in those games, averaging 9 targets per game and 17.3 half PPR fantasy points per game. I mean, an unstoppable force with Justin Herbert within this offense, and truly did fill into the shoes of Keenan Allen. They were incredibly big shoes, yet he filled them. Last season, amongst all receiving options in the slot, number 5 in targets, number 5 in receptions, number 2 in receiving yards, and number 4 in receiving touchdowns. Again, all the slot usage that Keenan Allen saw in 2023 transitioned into 2024, and I don't think that's going to stop going into 2025. This is a wide receiver that averaged 2.98 yards per route run versus man coverage, and was number 2 amongst all wide receivers within that category, amongst receivers that had themselves 115 routes ran against man coverage. Not only that, was number 3 in terms of receptions per routes run, and number 1 in terms of avoided tackles per routes run against man coverage. When you're sitting in the slot position, they put a nickel cornerback on you, and he continues to dice them up every single down. It's not a surprise if he continues this top 12 streak. Speaking of our number 12, we have Tyreek Hill. Now, the 2024 Dolphins certainly did struggle due to a lot of injuries, and of course, Tua Tagovailoa missing time. Now, Tua Tagovailoa wasn't the only player that got injured. There was injuries to Jaylen Waddle, and there was even an injury to Tyreek Hill. And even though he continued to fight through the pain, he did have a wrist ligament injury that plagued him all season long. He was questionable for many of us who had him on roster, questionable, doubtful for many weeks, and it did require surgery this offseason. And now that he's, of course, progressed and gotten to a better state, hopefully in 2025, he's going to return to being the elite top 12 option that we know he is. Because I mean, the 2 prior seasons, 2022 and 2023, as a Dolphin, was averaging 19 to 20 fantasy points per game. This most recent season, only averaging 13 fantasy points per game, even though that will get the job done to be a top 12 option, that's not the elite Tyreek Hill that we know. I mean, the elite Tyreek Hill that we know gets himself a 32% target percentage in 2022, 36% in 2023. As we approach 2025, I'm hoping for Tyreek Hill to get back into that elite conversation. I mean, again, prior to 2024, he had been a top 6 ranked fantasy wide receiver for 4 consecutive seasons. So if we're going to have ourselves a healthy Tua Tagovailoa, the absence of Jonnu Smith, who was getting himself 7.44 targets per game throughout the final 8 games in which he played with Tua Tagovailoa, I think his current ADP discount of having Tyreek Hill here at number 12, the risk is already baked in. So with that already taken into account, I think he's a perfect value as still a top 12 wide receiver going into the season. Moving on to our number 13, we have DJ Moore. Now in 2024, in the post-Shane Waldron era, Shane Waldron was the former offensive coordinator of the Bears. Once they fired him, from weeks 11 through 18, DJ Moore began to actually finally wake up, averaging 9.25 targets per game and 13.69 half PPR fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, in those 8 games, he didn't have a singular game of less than 7 targets and didn't have a single game less than 6 receptions. Again, the production was there, the opportunity was there, and that's what's truly most valuable. So going into this year, with another year and another offseason with Caleb Williams, yes, you have Ben Johnson joining the overall cause as their head coach and primary play caller, the former OC of the Detroit Lions. We are hoping, best case scenario, DJ Moore is put in a position to where he is going to be the Amon-Ra St. Brown of this offense, because Amon-Ra has seen 146, 164, and 141 targets in the last 3 seasons with Ben Johnson as his offensive coordinator. So if we're going to be able to put DJ Moore in positions to succeed, besides the fact that he is getting himself opportunities in the slot, out wide, he's also lining up in the backfield in the training camp, getting himself rushing attempts in terms of inside zones to score touchdowns, pre-snap motions, even the end arounds or the sweeps that they're going to continue to hand him off the ball. There's a lot of opportunity for DJ Moore to make noise and potentially even vie for a top 12 standing by the end of 2025. Moving on to our number 14, we have Mike Evans. I truly do believe that Mike Evans is one of the safest selections that you can make based on his history of success. 11 consecutive seasons of 1,000 receiving yards minimum. I mean, again, he is ranked as a top 10 fantasy wide receiver in 4 of the last 5 seasons, in 8 of the last 11 seasons. He continues to ball out, and he is never ranked below wide receiver 23 within a given year. Again, what makes him consistent is that he is always active and available. He has played 168 of the last 180 eligible games, healthy at a 93.33% rate. From 2014 to 2024, he has scored 105 receiving touchdowns in the last 168 games in which he has played. Again, there's a lot of potential for him to continue the successful streak of, again, this most recent season, averaging 15.22 fantasy points per game. And with losing Liam Cohen and potentially scoring less touchdowns, we could see him regress and end up at the number 14 spot. Again, History suggests that Mike Evans is going to continue to ball out, and even though he is at age 32 going into this upcoming season, can still dominate. The questions that surround Chris Godwin certainly make it a little bit worrisome as to whether or not we can trust Chris Godwin early in the season. And if he's going to miss time, that's only going to elevate the overall potential for Mike Evans early on in the season, and he could take that momentum for the entirety of 2025. Moving on to our number 15, we have T. Higgins, another wide receiver that had himself an incredibly strong finish to the 2024 season. But he's also very consistent like Mike Evans, but in a different way. Over the course of the last 4 seasons, T. Higgins, in terms of his fantasy point per game averages, has been number 12, 10, 16, and 4 amongst all wide receivers when playing with a healthy Joe Burrow. Those are incredible numbers. Now you may be wondering, Andrew, how is he top 16 every single time out, top 12 in 3 of the last 4 seasons, and yet he is still yet to rank above wide receiver 17 in his career? Well, that's mainly because he hasn't been able to stay healthy. Therefore, his best wide receiver seasons, while relatively healthy, has been wide receiver 17, 22, and 17. So as we approach this upcoming season, again, like I mentioned, had an incredible finish to his 2024 campaign, averaging 9.14 targets per game and 17 fantasy points per game once returning from injury from weeks 11 through 18. Had Higgins played a full 17 games in 2025, would have easily ranked as a top 12 wide receiver. And again, while Jamar Chase is on the other side of the field pulling double coverage at times, it allows Higgins to continue to ball out. My expectation is that if he's able to play a full healthy 17-game season, he's easily going to be in the top 12 conversation, considering the opportunity share and, of course, the consistency he has provided year over year. It's just a matter of whether he and Joe Burrow can continue to stay healthy, which we hope is going to be the case for 2025. Now, as we approach the 2025 season, quick little reminder, going into week 1 via Betr, his number in terms of receiving yards is 68.5. When we look at the last 10 games that T. Higgins played last season, 7 of his last 10 games, he has surpassed that number. He went more. So why not potentially go ahead and take advantage of that as they take on their division rival, the Cleveland Browns, in week 1. In the last 2 matchups in which he's taken on the Cleveland Browns, he had 82 receiving yards and 58 receiving yards. I understand that game of 58 wasn't more than 68.5, but he had 8 receptions in that game. Got himself an ample opportunity share, which he should see come week 1 of the 2025 season. All right, let's move on to our number 16. We have Davante Adams. I think Davante Adams, very similar to someone like Mike Evans, has himself a lot of consistency. I mean, we're talking about one of the best wide receivers in fantasy football over the course of the last 7 seasons, as he is quite literally ranked as a top 10 wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game on average and a half PPR in 6 of those 7 seasons. Now, when we look back at his 2024 campaign, obviously beginning with the Raiders and then finishing out with Aaron Rodgers and the Jets, from weeks 9 through 18, went back to being a top tier wide receiver, averaging 11 targets per game and 16.78 fantasy points per game. So again, he was able to join the offense, take over the number 1 role from Garrett Wilson, of course, because of his relationship with Aaron Rodgers. And now he has an opportunity of joining another offense that should be elite in 2025 with Matthew Stafford, another incredible quarterback that he's going to have an opportunity to play with. As it currently stands, the expectation and his role should be as the primary X receiver of this offense, but they're going to move him around. They're going to allow him to have opportunities very similar to what Cooper Kupp had last season. I mean, Cooper Kupp played 65% of his overall snaps from the slot position. I don't expect Davante Adams to play that much within the slot receiving role, but if in fact he's going to be utilized in that capacity in which he's given those opportunities, there's a lot of routes that Cooper Kupp ran last season that Davante Adams excels at, even at this age of his career. Specifically, the 3 most frequent routes that Cooper Kupp ran in 2024 were out routes, crossing routes, and hitch routes. Over the course of this most recent season, Davante Adams had a 2.45, 2.71, and 2.39 yards per route run average while running those routes. And then overall, in terms of his yards per route run average as a whole, I mean, those numbers were all improvements on his base number. The expectation is that Davante Adams should be highly relevant for fantasy purposes. If Matthew Stafford can stay healthy, of course, him and Puka Nacua should dominate in 2025. Moving on to the final player within this tier, we have DK Metcalf. Now, we just mentioned just moments ago Aaron Rodgers and his relationship with Davante Adams. And of course, as soon as Adams showed up late last season and became a New York Jet, he elevated to double-digit targets in being a fantasy monster. So why not someone like DK Metcalf, who has proven in the past to be an elite wide receiver? Back in 2020 and 2021, ranked as a top 12 wide receiver in both those seasons. In order to accomplish that, he had to put up a base minimum of 129 targets, 75 catches, 950 receiving yards, and 10 touchdowns in each of those 2 seasons. I think those are very accomplishable numbers considering he is the primary threat of this offense and with Aaron Rodgers. From 2008 to 2024, Aaron Rodgers' #1 receiver in his respective offenses have averaged 134 targets, 89 receptions, 1,192 receiving yards, and 10 receiving touchdowns per season. I mean, this most recent season, Garrett Wilson, weeks 1 through 6, 11 targets per game, 13 fantasy points per game. Davante Adams, weeks 7 through 18, 10 targets per game and nearly 15 fantasy points per game. The expectation is that, of course, DK Metcalf should excel within this offense, considering there really isn't very much target competition outside of Jonnu Smith, Pat Freiermuth, and Calvin Austin. Again, I don't think there's anything that's stopping DK Metcalf from getting 150 targets this upcoming season, besides perhaps the offensive play calling, which again, we have seen in the past Arthur Smith be able to support someone like, A.J. Brown in his days with the Tennessee Titans. Even though this most recent season with the Pittsburgh Steelers, Russell Wilson was averaging 30.5 passing attempts per game, which on a 17-game pace is a 520 total attempts as an offense. Aaron Rodgers in 2020, in his MVP campaign of 4,300 passing yards and 48 passing touchdowns, only had 526 passing attempts in that given year. I think DK Metcalf certainly is being undervalued and should be drafted at a higher rate going into the season. Moving on to our number 18, we have Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Like I mentioned just moments ago, DK Metcalf is a Pittsburgh Steeler. Tyler Lockett is a Tennessee Titan. So really, there isn't much to stop from Jaxon Smith-Njigba getting back into this top 18 conversation. And even though this most recent season he finished as a top 12 wide receiver option, I think that there are some potential struggles that could be within the future because of Sam Darnold and because of Clint Kubiak. Just depends on how this offense is going to produce come 2025. Now, this most recent season with Geno Smith and with all of the challenges of trying to out-target someone like DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, he still averaged 8 targets per game and nearly 12 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. In the couple games in which he played without DK Metcalf, was averaging 10 targets per game and an incredible amount of fantasy points, 21.7 to be exact. But as we approach this upcoming season, it's purely going to be a matter of how are they going to utilize him and how well will Sam Darnold play outside of a Kevin O'Connell offense. Sure, Sam Darnold is joining Clint Kubiak. He's a former offensive coordinator of the New Orleans Saints last season, the Minnesota Vikings in 2021, but was the passing game coordinator of the 49ers in 2023 while Sam Darnold is there. So they have a relationship, and hopefully Darnold can comfortably transition within this offense and look in the direction of Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who was the top slot receiving option in the National Football League last year. #1 in targets, receptions, and receiving yards within that category. Again, they're going to utilize a lot of pre-snap motion, a lot of play action within this offense. I'm anticipating a very healthy target share for Jaxon Smith-Njigba and the potential that if in fact the Seattle Seahawks outplay their projections, Jaxon Smith could very easily outplay this number 18 ranking. Moving on to number 19, we have Garrett Wilson. So I've got a lot to say about Garrett Wilson because there is still a lot of potential, regardless of who plays quarterback, for him to succeed because he has proven that in the past. But when we look back at last season, weeks 1 through 9 pre-Davante Adams takeover, 10.4 targets per game, 14.09 fantasy points per game. And of course, late in the second half of that season when Adams took over, he pretty much disappeared. But we're hoping for a very healthy opportunity share like he had early last year. And that could very easily be accomplished because of his rapport with Justin Fields, both of them playing together at Ohio State in 2019 and 2020. I mean, Justin Fields back in 2023 as the starting quarterback of the Bears was able to allow DJ Moore and elevate him into a conversation of averaging 16.8 fantasy points per game when they were both healthy and on the field together. Garrett Wilson has proven, like I mentioned, to be a solid wide receiver even with lesser quarterback play like Zach Wilson. Let's not forget Garrett Wilson has been able to achieve 1,000 plus receiving yards every single season of his career despite all the quarterback struggles that he has faced. And going into this upcoming year, hopefully Tanner Engstrom, the new offensive coordinator, is going to bring in a lot of the Lions' influences that we have seen in the most recent seasons. A lot of pre-snap motions, a lot of play action, moving around the overall formation, potentially utilizing him as the Amon-Ra St. Brown of this offense. Now, these Detroit Lions influences are going to positively impact Garrett Wilson. In his career, anytime that there's been a play with motion, he's averaging 2.34 yards per route run and 0.44 fantasy points per route run in a full PPR. In terms of plays with play action, 2.57 yards per route run and 0.52 fantasy points per route run. There's a lot of potential for him to succeed this upcoming season. Regardless of the fact that Justin Fields is a primary running quarterback, he has proven that he can elevate wide receivers such as DJ Moore, so why not Garrett Wilson? Number 20, we have Courtland Sutton. Looking back at 2024, there was a huge turning point midway through the season. Many of us remember it who had Courtland Sutton on roster. In week 7 against the New Orleans Saints, there was a complete debacle. Thursday Night Football had 0 targets. After that point, Courtland Sutton became a different wide receiver. From weeks 8 through 19, averaging 8.82 targets per game and 14.5 fantasy points per game. Doubled his fantasy point game production when we compare the last stretch of the season in comparison to weeks 1 through 7. So going into this year, if we're going to be in a position in which, again, he's going to continue to ball out. I mean, throughout that span of time from weeks 8 through 19, was number 2 amongst all wide receivers in terms of air yards, had a 2.29 yard per route run average, had a 25% target rate, targeted on 1 out of every 4 routes that he ran. Again, he's an incredible deep ball receiving threat, top 10 in each of the categories of target, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns, 20 or more yards down the field. He was number 1 amongst all Denver Broncos in terms of red zone targets and, of course, red zone receiving touchdowns. As long as those continue to stay consistent, Bo Nix and him, they should continue to find success this upcoming season. Number 21, we have Terry McLaurin. Again, he's currently still dealing with contract negotiations. He's requested a trade. Hopefully that is going to be settled in the near future because, again, the amount of success that he found last season was fantastic. Again, a lot of touchdowns, but prior to Jaden Daniels arriving to the Washington Commanders, I mean, Terry McLaurin had put together some lackluster seasons because he had played with 10 different starting quarterbacks between 2020 to 2023. But as soon as, of course, he built a rapport with Jaden Daniels from weeks 3 through 21, averaging 14.8 fantasy points per game and a half PPR as a primary vertical threat within this offense, 20 plus yards down the field, top 10 in all categories of targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. So if we're going to be in a position in which, of course, he's going to continue to be utilized within that form, fantastic. But I do anticipate regression because this most recent season, he scored 13 receiving touchdowns, 10 of which were caught within the red zone. Last season, he had 14 red zone targets that led to 10 receiving touchdowns. That is a number that cannot be repeated unless they're going to explicitly design plays that have a 100% success rate. Going into this upcoming season, I do anticipate a little bit of regression due to Deebo Samuel's implementation, but all in all, should still be a top 24 option. Moving on to our number 22, we have Tetairoa McMillan, the rookie wide receiver that has been drafted by the Carolina Panthers. Now, when we talk about the history of success that wide receivers drafted this early have found, since 2015, there have been 12 rookie wide receivers that were drafted in the top 10 of their respective NFL draft. 8 of those 12 wide receivers had healthy rookie seasons. 7 of those 8 wide receivers ranked within the top 36 their rookie season. Fantastic numbers. Since 2019, first-round wide receivers who played a minimum of 15 games have averaged 115 targets, 72 receptions, 970 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, and 168 fantasy points and a half PPR, which would make you a top 24 wide receiver option. So why not someone like Tetairoa McMillan, a 6'4", 220-pound wide receiver that has a very similar build to guys like Drake London and Mike Evans. And the reason why I mentioned Mike Evans in specific is because Dave Canales, the current head coach and primary play caller of the Carolina Panthers, is a former OC of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers back in 2023. In that year, Mike Evans had 152 targets, 87 grabs, 1,400 yards, 14 receiving touchdowns. An incredible season. So why not Tetairoa McMillan to be the Mike Evans of this offense? When Dave Canales has been asked about Tetairoa McMillan this offseason, he said the following: he's going to get targeted a lot. He's going to be a big part of what we do. We're going to challenge him. If they're going to continue to send the ball in his direction, because again, he is only ever competing with Adam Thielen, who's getting up there in age, and Xavier Leggett, I expect McMillan to be a fantastic option. A wide receiver that amongst his draft class was number 1 in terms of yards per reception, was number 3 in terms of forced missed tackles, and again, was number 1 in terms of yards per route run from the slot position. If he gets some slot receiving work, I mean, again, we saw a lot of success from Adam Thielen within this offense last season, so why not McMillan in 2025? Number 23, we have Xavier Worthy. The only reason I have Xavier Worthy this high is because I do anticipate a suspension to Rashee Rice. And if that is looming, again, I don't want to rank Rashee Rice because I'm still uncertain as to how many games he is going to potentially be suspended for. But in the event in which he is suspended, it is going to allow for a lot more opportunity early on in the season for Xavier Worthy to, grab opportunity within this offense and run with it. Just like he did late last season from weeks 11 through 21, the back end of the regular season and going into the postseason, averaging 14.6 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. In games last season in which Worthy was given ample opportunity, and specifically in games in which he had 5 or more touches, was averaging 13.67 fantasy points per game. there's a lot of potential for success going into 2025 because there's been a lot of conversations in regards to the Kansas City Chiefs trying to spread out this offense and their deep ball operation in terms of getting more opportunities for someone like Xavier Worthy 20, 30 yards down the field. I mean, we have to remember, he has the fastest recorded 40-yard dash time in NFL Combine history. Now, again, this could be wishful thinking that we're going to hope that the potential of Patrick Mahomes' ADOT, which was 6.9 last season, I think it was like the third lowest amongst all quarterbacks. He was in the category with Gardner Minshew. Let's just put it that way. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but I'm hoping that Xavier Worthy is going to get himself ample opportunity. The suspension of Rashee Rice will elevate him as a top 24 option. Number 24, we have Jameson Williams. This time last year, Jameson Williams was getting a lot of hype in training camp. And once again, for another consecutive season, that is happening. The coaching staff of the Detroit Lions are continuing to mention him. Now, this time last year when that occurred, he followed with a fantastic season in 2024, averaging 12.23 fantasy points per game. Now, even with this being the case, if they're going to continue to utilize him, he is going to be fantasy relevant because he is a big playmaker. Even though he didn't get himself very many targets per game, averaging 5.94 targets per game last season in healthy games, he is a player that is going to be able to score a bunch of touchdowns. Now, the touchdowns that he did score last season consisted of the following yardages. Okay, he scored 9 total touchdowns, 7 through the air, 2 on the ground. He had a 52, 70, 64, 61, 37, 82, 42 yard touchdown. Again, ridiculous numbers. And then he had 2 3-yard touchdowns. All in all, he made a lot of his work off of plays in which he, had a reception and or rush and went to the house. And if he's going to be able to continue to build upon that, fantastic. But even in games in which he didn't score a touchdown last season, there were 8 regular season games of those variety. 5 of those 8 games consisted of him having 5 or more receptions. So if we're going to see an expanded role, more touches, more implied rushing upside, and the potential of him continuing to score touchdowns because of his playmaking ability, why not top 24? Number 25, we have DeVonta Smith. Listen, last season, while healthy, 12.72 fantasy points per game on a low 6.85 targets per game, which is the lowest target per game average he's had since 2022. Now, despite all this being the case, with the lowest targets per game on average, scored the most fantasy points per game on average that he has scored in the last 3 seasons. So as we approach this upcoming season, just like which I mentioned with A.J. Brown, if this offense is going to unlock a little bit more of their passing upside because of Saquon Barkley not being as efficient of a runner and not being able to take rushes of 70 plus yards on a consistent basis. This most recent season, if we include the regular season and the postseason, Saquon Barkley had like 8 rushes of 50 or more yards. So if we're going to be in a situation in which those opportunities are not taken away from DeVonta Smith to get himself more involvement, he's still a wide receiver that in this most recent season, when healthy, had 9 of his 13 games consist of 11 or more fantasy points in a half PPR, a consistent option very easily in the top 25 conversation. Number 26, let's stay within the NFC East, and let's talk about the new wide receiver of the Dallas Cowboys, George Pickens. George Pickens, throughout his career, has played with the following quarterbacks: Kenny Pickett, Mitchell Trubisky, Mason Rudolph, Justin Fields, and Russell Wilson. And despite all of those struggles, he has still been a decent wide receiver. This most recent season, from week 7 through 18 with Russell Wilson, averaging 11.76 half PPR fantasy points per game, but now has an opportunity of playing with Dak Prescott, by far and away the best quarterback that he has played with in his career. And if we want to quantify just how bad his quarterbacks have been in recent seasons, from 2022 to 2024, 29% of the overall targets that George Pickens had were deemed uncatchable. If we're talking about the overall accuracy of Dak Prescott since 2022, in terms of passing attempts, 10 or more yards down the field, he's the 5th best in terms of total accuracy. I'm anticipating to see someone like Dak Prescott unlock the potential of George Pickens. And sure, he is competing for targets with CeeDee Lamb, but both are going to find success, especially deep down the field. There's a lot of potential for George Pickens because of how accurate Dak Prescott has been. This most recent season, of course, George Pickens had himself the 4th most targets amongst all wide receivers, 20 or more yards down the field. Dak Prescott back in 2023 had the 5th most attempts, 20 or more yards down the field. Of course, a deep ball quarterback that hopefully is going to have to throw the ball a bunch this upcoming season in negative game scripts. We haven't seen a relevant wide receiver 2 within this offense since 2023 with Brandon Cooks there, finishing as wide receiver 36, or Amari Cooper back in 2021 as wide receiver 27. I think 26 is a pretty good option here within this Brian Schottenheimer offense. Our number 27, Marvin Harrison Jr. obviously didn't live up to expectation within his rookie season. And quite frankly, 7 targets per game, even though it's not a horrible number, the 10.34 fantasy points per game that he averaged is just not great. So when we're talking about an offense that going into this upcoming season is still purely focused on getting their tight ends opportunities and running the ball consistently with Kyler Murray and James Conner, it does leave Marvin Harrison as an afterthought. There's a reason why he only had 116 total targets this most recent season, as one of the most anticipated wide receivers to come out of college, the number 4 overall pick in 2024. If you're going to utilize him in only that kind of a capacity, unless the numbers drastically increase in terms of overall opportunity share, neither will his overall fantasy point production, which is why I sit him here at number 27, because I truly do think that, yes, even though he has himself a lot of legacy and a lot of talent, unless it is unlocked in the proper form, it's not going to lead to much success. Just like Drake London in prior seasons, it takes an offensive coordinator and a quarterback to be able to unlock him as much as it does to his own individual skill. Number 28, we have Jakobi Meyers, who has been an incredible fantasy asset for the last 4 seasons, finishing as the overall wide receiver 33, 28, 24, and 23 overall. I mean, last season in the post-Davante Adams era, from weeks 4 through 18, averaging 9.33 targets per game and 12 fantasy points per game. Now that we approach the 2025 season with Geno Smith as his quarterback, again, that's a huge upgrade in comparison to Minshew, O'Connell, Ritter, Garoppolo, and Hoyer over the course of the last 2 seasons. Yet again, Jakobi Meyers has finished as a top 24 ranked wide receiver in both those seasons. So with the upgrade, with Chip Kelly as the offensive coordinator, we look back at the 2013 through 2015 Eagles, in which Chip Kelly was the primary play caller of those offenses. I mean, we had Deshaun Jackson with 228 fantasy points in 2013. We had Jeremy Maclin in 2014 with 235 fantasy points, 1,300 yards, 10 touchdowns. Jordan Matthews in 2015, 997 yards, 8 touchdowns, 85 grabs, 188 receiving yards. Jakobi Meyers could be in line for a fantastic season. I expect a lot of those targets to go towards Brock Bowers, their primary receiving option, but Jakobi Meyers should not be slept upon. Number 29, we have Jaylen Waddle. Look, Jaylen Waddle, as long as he is healthy and playing with a healthy Tua Tagovailoa, they are both relevant. But again, he hasn't seen himself enough of a target share to deem him anything better than a middle-ranged wide receiver 3. Because this most recent season, 5.88 targets per game wasn't going to cut it. He presented far too much inconsistency of production, a couple boom performances, but majority of them being lackluster and underwhelming, and really did hurt our fantasy teams because, again, he was only targeted on 17% of the routes that he ran last season with Tua healthy. Now that we get rid of Jauan Smith, who between weeks 8 through 16 was averaging 7.44 targets per game, if Darren Waller is not going to exact and kind of accumulate all those in his direction because he's not even playing, there's a lot of opportunity that could potentially go in the direction of Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle that should elevate them this upcoming season. Number 30, we have Zay Flowers. I think the number 30 spot is perfect considering he's ranked between number 30 and 24 in the last 2 seasons. Again, this most recent year, averaging 10.6 fantasy points per game. Lamar Jackson, of course, had himself an MVP unstoppable season, and in that overall effort was able to elevate Zay Flowers to having a 26% target share, a 26% yardage share, and only a 10% touchdown share. That's really what's going to elevate Zay Flowers to a position to where I could feel more comfortable drafting him higher and ranking him higher. It's purely a matter of, is he going to score more touchdowns? If in fact he does, fantastic. In the event in which, of course, we see regression from Lamar Jackson and more opportunities directed towards guys like Derrick Henry, Rashad Bateman, the new addition, DeAndre Hopkins, it certainly could impact Zay Flowers. I mean, shoot, once Isaiah Likely gets healthy, him and Mark Andrews are going to go ahead and score majority of the touchdowns as well. So, of course, it does limit the potential upside for Zay Flowers. Number 31, we have Chris Olave. Concussions and injuries are the end-all be-all for his career. He has been diagnosed with 5 concussions in his short NFL career, and what really did knock him out last season was sustaining 2 of them within 4 weeks. That is incredibly scary, and hopefully he's able to stay healthy for the remainder of his career, and he's not going to sustain any more concussions, because what Chris Olave has proven in the past in 2022 and 2023, ranking as wide receiver 25 and 19, that when he stays healthy, he is relevant. So with Kellen Moore coming in as the head coach of this team, a former offensive coordinator for the Eagles in 2024, the Chargers in 2023, and the Cowboys from 2019 to 2022, we have seen him make wide receivers such as A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith, Keenan Allen, CeeDee Lamb relevant with lesser opportunities. We're hoping that Tyler Shuck is the real deal right out the gate, because a rookie quarterback in negative game scripts certainly should be looking in the direction of his number 1 receiving option, which is going to be Chris Olave. Number 32, we have Calvin Ridley to begin the G tier. Look, Calvin Ridley is going to be in a pretty solid spot considering he gets a huge upgrade at the quarterback position, or we are anticipating it to be a huge upgrade considering how bad Will Levis and Mason Rudolph were last season. And despite how bad they were and how inaccurate they were, again, the Tennessee Titans passing game was the 6th lowest in terms of passing accuracy amongst all teams last season. Yet Calvin Ridley was wide receiver 27. Now, midway through the year last season, we did see a lot of complaints from Calvin Ridley going to the media. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. From weeks 8 through 17, 7.9 targets per game, 11.92 fantasy points per game. He was number 1 amongst all wide receivers last season in terms of air yards. He had exactly 47.76% of the Tennessee Titans air yards amongst all receiving options, a 16.0 ADOT, which was 7th amongst all wide receivers. If Cam Ward is just a solid quarterback, the number 32 spot is a bare minimum for Calvin Ridley if he's able to stay healthy for 17 games. Because of what we've seen from other first-round selected quarterbacks in the most recent seasons, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, their respective wide receivers were relevant their rookie seasons. DJ Moore, number 16 overall last season. Terry McLaurin, 6. Courtland Sutton, 13. Adam Thielen, 25. And Nico Collins, 9. Calvin Ridley should be in line for a fantastic season here and hopefully better than number 32. Number 33 is Jauan Jennings. Now, Jauan Jennings sits in this position primarily because of the fact that we have no Brandon Ayuk due to the ACL injury and the traded Deebo Samuel. So as we approach 2025, Jauan Jennings, if he's able to stay healthy, potentially ink a new contract because, again, he has been elevated to being the number 1 wide receiver of this offense due to injuries and trades and circumstance. Hopefully, everything is settled and he can go ahead and have himself a fantastic 2025 season and continue the success that he found late last year. From weeks 10 through 18 last season without Ayuk in the lineup, 8.5 targets per game, 11.23 fantasy points per game, and that doesn't even include the 41-point performance that he put up against the Rams last season within those averages. It doesn't even include that. So again, he has himself a stable floor of opportunity and production. The 49ers have one of the easiest strength of schedules going into this upcoming season. They should be winning far more games, which should put them into far more positions of scoring touchdowns. Number 34 is Jerry Jeudy. Look, there is Jerry Jeudy with and without Jameis Winston. With Winston, he averaged 17.59 fantasy points per game and a 24% target share. Without Winston last season, 7 fantasy points per game. The Cleveland Browns last season were number 4 amongst all teams in terms of wide receiver targets. They're going to continue to have to throw the ball a bunch this season because of the negative game scripts that they're going to be implicated for. What we have heard positively this offseason is that Joe Flacco is taking the bulk majority of first-team reps. That is going to help Jerry Jeudy in his fantasy upside, and it's also going to help someone like David Njoku. But in the case of someone like Jerry Jeudy, we look back to 2023 Joe Flacco with the Cleveland Browns. In his time there as the primary starting quarterback with Amari Cooper, he was targeting Amari Cooper 12.33 times per game. If the opportunities are there, Jerry Jeudy should still be a relevant top 34 option. Number 35, we have Matthew Golden. So I've done a lot of research in regards to wide receivers that are selected in the first round and their potential for success. So let's go ahead and let's begin with the following statistics. From 2019 to 2024, rookie wide receivers that have ranked within the top 36, okay? There have been 29 such wide receivers, which is a 4.83 per season average, okay? Just putting it out there. In terms of the per round distribution, there have been a total of 25 of the 29 wide receivers that were either drafted in the first or second round of their respective draft, which again, that's 86.21% of the overall contribution. Fantastic, because Matthew Golden was drafted in the first round by the Green Bay Packers, and I do anticipate him to be their number 1 option. Now, when we continue to look at stats, since 2019, when we talk about first-round wide receivers that played a minimum of 15 games, they averaged 168 fantasy points in their rookie year, 115 targets, 72 receptions, 970 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns. So of those eligible 19 wide receivers that played 15 or more games, 15 of them were top 36 ranked within their rookie season. That's a 79% success rate. As the primary number 1 receiving option of the Green Bay Packers, I'm anticipating that to be Matthew Golden this season. I would expect him to be fantasy relevant at a top 36 capacity, considering what Jaden Reed has done this most recent season. Jaden Reed, sure, was a top 36 ranked wide receiver, averaging 4.69 targets per game with a healthy Jordan Love. That is not enough. So when we see the lackluster usage of Jaden Reed, the torn ACL of Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, whose role changes every other week, a lack of competition for targets makes me think that Matthew Golden could be this year's BTJ, not in terms of peak production, but in terms of instantly becoming the number one of the offense that he joins because of the first round draft capital that this team utilized on him. I'm anticipating Matthew Golden to be at a top 36 capacity. I'm not drafting him at wide receiver 36, but I'm definitely taking the current discount that he is at his ADP. Moving on to number 36, we have Travis Hunter. I'm sure many of you were wondering, where do I have him? I don't even know how much he's going to play offensively. I truly don't know. I just mentioned a couple statistics in regards to the potential of Matthew Golden. I'll repeat them. When we talk about since 2015, there have been 12 rookie wide receivers selected in the top 10 of their respective draft. Of course, Travis Hunter, the number 2 overall selection of the 2025 NFL draft. Of those 12 wide receivers, 8 of them had healthy rookie seasons. 7 of those 8 wide receivers ranked within the top 36. So the odds are that Travis Hunter is going to finish as a top 36 ranked wide receiver, but I have no clue how much he is going to play. And that is certainly going to, be the entire impact for his potential for success. Because if he's going to be a 50-50 player, playing 50% offensive snaps and defensive snaps, or if he's going to be a primary just cornerback and be, on a couple packages offensively, it's going to be way different than if he's a full-time wide receiver playing only on a couple packages for defense. Until we can get a clear answer as to what that's going to be, you're basically just drafting him off of potential, off of the hope that Liam Cohen, an offensive-minded head coach, is going to utilize him at a high capacity early on into the season. I mean, what he was able to do with guys like Chris Godwin, McMillan, Mike Evans last season, hopefully he can accomplish with guys like Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter this upcoming season. But again, it's just purely a matter of how much is he going to play offensively. All right, let's move on to Rome Odunze. Look, the fact of the matter is we are hoping that Rome Odunze could have a Jameson Williams-esque jump with Ben Johnson as the offensive coordinator here. Yes, there's a lot of target competition with DJ Moore, Colston Loveland, Cole Kmet, Luther Burden, DeAndre Swift, but Rome Odunze should be the number 2 receiving option of this offense after DJ Moore. And if that in fact is the case, top 36 should be at a base minimum. But again, considering there's still a lot of uncertainties as to how great Caleb Williams is going to be, we leave him at 37. Stefon Diggs is at number 38. He's coming off of an ACL injury and perhaps has the quickest recovery I've ever seen. He's running routes right now. I mean, he is incredibly ahead of schedule after sustaining a November ACL tear. And going into this upcoming season, there's a lot of potential for him within a Josh McDaniels offense to find success, because we have recently seen in 2022 Davante Adams, 180 targets within the offense with Josh McDaniels as the primary play caller. The 2021 New England Patriots, the last time Josh McDaniels was here, 126 targets in the direction of Jakobi Meyers, who is the primary slot receiving option of that offense. This most recent season, as a member of the Houston Texans, Stefon Diggs did play a lot of his overall opportunities within the slot, which certainly could take place once again this year. Number 39 is Deebo Samuel. Terry McLaurin's overall status is certainly going to play a huge factor as to whether or not Deebo Samuel will retain a top 40 standing or potentially even be better. Time will tell, but he ended his 49ers career with some incredibly ugly performances. I think like 6 of the last 8 games consisted of 25 or fewer receiving yards. Pretty rough end, which hopefully is going to be improved upon as a member of the Washington Commanders. To close out the video, we have Chris Godwin. I have no idea what his overall injury status is. Obviously, he's not practicing right now, and obviously he had complications to where not only did he need to have one surgery, but another surgery in the offseason, which typically isn't par for the course. So considering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers still have Mike Evans, McMillan, and utilize first-round draft capital on Egbuka, there's an expectation that, of course, Chris Godwin doesn't need to return early. And if he doesn't, then he may not be as fantasy relevant or may not even be the same wide receiver that he once was. Time will tell, but we leave him at number 40 because of the uncertainty. I know this was an incredibly long video, but I wanted to get you guys all the information I possibly could put within a single video to set you guys up for success. If you guys enjoyed today's content, subscribe to the channel, check out Betr, check out the Patreon. I'll be back tomorrow with more fantasy football content, of course, daily for the entire season in order to help you guys capture championships. Until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.